All right, this is Mr. Barr, and this is powers of I. So when I have an I and I raise it to different powers, different things are going to happen. So I start with an I to the first. I to the first is just I, which is defined as the square root of -1. Now here, we've talked about this one before, I squared, well, that's the square root of -1 times the square root of -1, which is 1. So I know I squared is -1. -1. I'm not sure what I just said. I to the third, well, I to the third is really just an I squared times an I. And since I squared equals -1, this becomes -1I. Give me just a second. All right, sorry for the interruption. So I know that I squared is -1, so I to the third is really I squared times I, and I squared is -1, so this is -1 times I, or -I. And then I to the fourth is really I squared times I squared, which is -1 times -1, which is a +1. And then this pattern just keeps repeating. So I to the fifth is the same thing as I to the first, I to the sixth is the same thing as I to the second, I to the fourth, and so on like this. And really what you're going to do is you're going to be subtracting out I to the fourths when we get to this. But let's keep this available right here. And I'll show you as the powers get higher. So I to the third is a -I. I to the fourth is, I know that's up 1. Just referring back to my notes on this, right there. I to the second is a -1. I to the fifth. Okay, now here's how it works. It's an I to the fifth. Subtract a 4 from it, and it turns it into an I, right? 5 minus 4 turns it into an I, which is just an I. I to the ninth. Okay, subtract out 4. That turns it into an I to the fifth. Subtract out 4. That turns it into an I. I to the seventh. Subtract out 4. That turns it into an I to the third. I to the third is -I. 96. All right, well, 96, I'm just going to use my calculator. 96 is actually divisible by 4, which means it's an I to the fourth. 96 is divisible by 4, which means it's just an I to the fourth, which is a 1. 60. Okay, let's divide 60 by 4. 60 divided by 4 is 15. 4 goes into it perfectly, which means it's just an I to the fourth, which is a 1. 682. 682. 682 divided by 4. It does not go in perfectly. So let's find some logic on this one. So 684. No, excuse me, 682. 682 divided by 4 is 170.5. So it's something weird. So let's just go with this. Let's divide it by 170. Actually, let's take out, what's 4 times 170? 4 times 170 is 680. So really, between 682 and 680 is a power of 2. This is a square. This is the same thing as I squared. I squared, which is -1. $355. Okay, 355. Got to figure out what's going on with this thing. Okay, 355. 355 divided by 4. That's 88.75. Well, let's go 4 times 88. I'm dropping off the decimal. That's 352. Well, this is 355, this is 352. It's got a power of 3 difference. So it's I to the third, which is -I. I to the -1. Ooh, I had not anticipated this. Where where am I at? 74. Okay, I to the negative 1. I to the negative 1. Remember how to use tickets to ride the math elevator? This is 1 over I. And now I would have to rationalize it, make it look good. That's going to become I. Where's my thing? I over negative 1, which is negative I. I to the negative 1 is negative I. It's just like a third power. So I guess if we came back here, since it's following a pattern, it is following a pattern, isn't it? Let's take, so subtracting 1, this would be I to the 0. This would be I to the negative 1. This would be I to the negative 2. This would be I to the negative 3. If I just kind of, oops, can't see what I'm doing. Kind of following a pattern there. So I to the negative 1 is negative I. I to the negative 2 is negative 1. Just looking at my paper now. I to the negative 6. Okay, negative 6. Well, if I take away 4, that takes me, if I go up 4, look, plus 4 takes me I to the negative 2. I think it's I to the negative 2, which is the negative 1. I don't even know, man. Now I'm just kind of making stuff up. I to the negative 2 is negative 1. Negative 5. Adding 4 to it takes me to negative 1, so I to the negative 1, which is negative I. Negative 9, adding 4 takes me to I to the negative 1, which is negative I. Once again, just adding 4s to stuff. Negative 95, okay, 95, so 95 divided by 4 is 23. 23 times 4 is 92. All right, so 92 and 95, the difference is 3. I think this is I to the negative 3, which is I. 46. 46 divided by 4 is 11. 11 times 4 is 44. This is a 46. The difference is 2. It's a negative 2, which means it's a negative I. No, it's a negative 1. 825. 825 divided by 4 is 206. 206 times 4 is 824. This is 825. The difference is a power of 1. It's a negative, so it's a negative 1, which means negative I. I got this. 950. It's positive this time. 950 divided by 4 is 237. 237 times 4 is 948. This is 950. It's a difference of 2. It's a positive 2. So it's going to be the negative 1. 177 divided by 4 is 44.25. 44 times 4 is 176. This is 177. It's a power of 1, which is just I. Boom. All right. I think I figured that one out. Thank you for watching. It's time for me to go teach a class.